A real clay tablet records kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. This is the Sumerian king list, a profound mystery carved into ancient earth. Historian Gwendolyn Lake observed that this list is not a modern history book, but a statement about the very nature of kingship itself. By the end of this exploration, you will hold the key to understanding how the first civilizations invented their own past to control their present. We will uncover why myth and history are seamlessly woven together, and what these impossible reign lengths were truly meant to communicate. How do you think a society decides what is worth remembering forever? The dust of ancient Mesopotamia held more than just sand. In the late 19th century, archaeologists like Hermann Hilprecht began carefully excavating the great mounds that marked the sites of forgotten cities, their hands sifting through layers of time. At places like Nippur and Lhasa and Isin, they uncovered broken pieces of baked clay, fragments that at first glance seemed like countless other administrative records. But as these pieces were cleaned and studied, a startling pattern emerged. They were not lists of grain or livestock, they were lists of kings, and the numbers beside their names defied all logic. Here was a ruler said to have governed for 28,000 years, another for 36,000. These were not simple scribble errors, they were deliberate, repeated across multiple copies found in different cities. The most famous of these artifacts is the Weld Blundell Prism, a curious octagonal clay column now resting in the Ashmolean Museum. Its four sides are covered in neat, precise cuneiform script, column after column of names and reign lengths, a royal lineage stretching back into a shadowy, unimaginable past. Scholar Peter Michalowski notes that when these texts were first translated, the academic world was baffled. How could anyone take this as history? The numbers were impossible. This confusion was the first major clue that the Sumerian king list was not what it appeared to be. Its discovery was not a single eureka, a moment, but a slow assembly of a puzzle, revealing that this particular story of kingship was copied and recopied for centuries. Why would generation after generation of scribes carefully inscribe a chronology they knew could not be literally true? The motivation was not historical accuracy, but something far more powerful, rooted in the very political fabric of the world that created these tablets. The opening lines of the Prism hold the key to the entire mystery. After kingship descended from heaven, Eridu became the seat of kingship. In Eridu, Ululim ruled for 28,800 years. This is not a dry historical record, it is a sacred incantation, a statement of cosmic origin. The list begins not with men, but with beings who straddle the line between deity and monarch, ruling for spans of time that belong to the realm of myth. 8 kings are named, presiding over 5 cities before a great deluge, their reigns adding up to 241,200 years. Ululim of Eridu, Alalga of Eridu, Enmen, Luana of Bad Tabira, who ruled for 43,200 years. Each name is a piece of a theological puzzle. Scholar Thorkel Jacobsen argued that these impossibly long reigns served a profound function. They connected the human institution of kingship directly to the divine order. In the Sumerian worldview, everything of importance, from the art of writing to the concept of kingship, was governed by divine decrees known as the Me. Kingship was not a human invention. It was a sacred office lowered from the heavens, a stabilizing force for all of society. The Antediluvian kings, therefore, were not meant to be read as historical figures in our modern sense. They were symbolic anchors, their immense reigns representing a primordial, perfect time when the divine and human worlds were intimately close. Their fantastical rule lengths communicated an unchanging, eternal quality to the very idea of royal authority. So when the scribes carved that Ululim ruled for 28,800 years, They were not recording a fact, they were making a claim about where true power comes from and how it legitimizes the king sitting on the throne today. This seamless blending of gods and kings forces a fundamental question. Was this list ever intended to be literal history, or was it always something more profound, a mythic charter for civilization itself? The answer begins to crystallize as the narrative reaches its pivotal turning point, a cataclysm that resets the clock and changes everything. Then came the Great Reset. The list states it with chilling simplicity: the flood swept over the earth. In those 5 words, the entire primordial world is washed away. This is the universal pivot point, the narrative hinge upon which the entire king list turns. Across Mesopotamian culture, from the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra to the Babylonian Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, this deluge story was a foundational memory of a world made clean. It serves the same function in the list, acting as a divine eraser. Everything before the flood belongs to the realm of gods and cosmic time. Everything after it begins the slow, steady march toward human history. As Dr. Irving Finkel of the British Museum has noted, the post-Diluvian kings are a different category altogether. Their reigns, while still fantastically long by our standards, plummet from tens of thousands of years to mere centuries or even decades. The first dynasty after the waters recede is established at the city of Kish, and the list declares that once more kingship was lowered from heaven. This is the crucial repetition, the propaganda in plain sight. By resetting the clock at Kish, the scribes are not just telling a story, they are making a profound political statement. They are asserting that the current ruling city, whichever one commissioned this particular version of the list, is the legitimate heir to a kingship that survived the world's end. It connects them directly to that renewed divine mandate. So the flood narrative becomes a powerful literary tool, a way to wipe the slate clean and begin a new lineage that favors one city-state over all others. But if the list was meant to legitimize, whose legitimacy was it promoting? The answer lies in the ink and clay itself, in the very hands that wrote these words and the rival kings they sought to glorify or erase. But the king list presents a world of perfect order. A single golden scepter passed from one city to the next. Kish falls and kingship moves to Uruk. Uruk's glory fades and it travels to Ur. This is a clean, linear story of divine favor shifting in a neat, unbroken chain. Yet if we could look at a map of that ancient world, we would see a very different reality. The land between the rivers was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, places like Ur, Lagash, Uruk, and Kish, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own army, and its own claim to power. For centuries, these cities coexisted, competed, and often clashed. Archaeological evidence, from royal inscriptions to economic tablets, confirms that many of the dynasties presented as successive in the list actually reigned at the same time. So why does the document insist on a singular, sequential narrative? This is the list's second great mystery, the phenomenon of simultaneous dynasties. Historian Mark van der Meerup offers a compelling key. He suggests the list operates on a concept of hegemony. The scribes who compiled it were not trying to catalogue every king who ever lived. They were tracking which one city held the recognized title of kingship, the Sumerian concept of Nam-Lugal, at any given moment. In their view, there could only be one true holder of this divine office, one city whose ruler was the primary intermediary between the gods and all of Mesopotamia. All other contemporary rulers, no matter how powerful, were simply omitted, relegated to the status of local governors or unworthy rivals. This transforms the king list from a flawed history into a brilliant ideological construct. It presents a unified, orderly vision of the past that never truly existed. a propaganda tool designed to justify the supremacy of whichever city-state was powerful enough to commission the latest version. The omissions are as telling as the inclusions. Take the powerful city of Lagash, for instance. Archaeology reveals it had a long and influential line of rulers, yet it is completely absent from the standard king list. Its dynasty was literally written out of the official story, likely because it was a bitter rival to the cities that controlled the narrative. What can these deliberate silences tell us? They reveal the fingerprints of the winners in an ancient game of political legacy. Every name etched into the clay represents a claim to absolute legitimacy, and every name left out represents a competitor successfully erased from the official memory. This selective recording forces us to ask a more pointed question: who exactly were the scribes holding the stylus, and what master were they truly serving? The stylus that carved these names was wielded by a member of the most powerful class in Mesopotamia, the scribe. In the quiet, lamp-lit rooms of temple and palace archives, the Dubsar worked, his hands skilled at mixing the perfect clay and sharpening the reed to a fine point. His training was long and arduous, beginning in childhood, mastering thousands of complex cuneiform signs and the entire corpus of Sumerian literature. This was not a neutral profession, it was the very engine of state administration and ideology. As historian Dominique Charpin has emphasized, list-making was a foundational intellectual act in Mesopotamia, a way to organize the world from inventories of sheep to the movements of stars. A list imposed order, and no list was more powerful than the one that ordered time itself, the king list. These scribes were not freelance historians, they were elite bureaucrats directly employed by the royal court. Their livelihood, their status, and their family's future depended on the favor of the king who commissioned their work. When they pressed the signs for Kish was defeated, its kingship was carried to Uruk, they were not recording a simple military loss. They were performing a ritual of legitimacy, using the authority of the written word to shape how all future generations would perceive the past. The repetitive, formulaic language of the list is its greatest tell. Each transfer of power follows the same sacred script, creating a hypnotic rhythm of destiny. This was not neutral reporting, it was a crafted narrative of divine favor, a story where the rise and fall of cities was presented as the inevitable will of the gods, all leading to the present ruler who held the tablet in his hands. The scribe's task was to embed his patron within that grand, preordained sequence, to make his reign feel like the culmination of a cosmic plan. This invites a darker, more practical question. Who, in a moment of political crisis, would have most needed this kind of document? Was it a new dynasty, fresh from conquest, desperate to cement its shaky claim? Or was it an established king facing rebellion, using the weight of written tradition to remind his rivals of their ordained place? The clay tablet was less a history book and more a weapon of soft power, fired from the scriptorium to win the war for memory. And if the scribes could shape the story of kings, what other profound truths about their world did they encode into the very structure of their most famous list? These impossible numbers are the list's third and most perplexing mystery. A king named Dumuzid the Shepherd is said to have ruled for 36,000 years. Another, Enmengal-Ona, reigned for 28,800. Even after the Great Flood, the figures remain staggering, with reigns of 1,200 or 1,500 years common. To our modern minds, these are clear fiction, but to dismiss them as mere fantasy is to miss their profound purpose. Scholars have spent decades untangling this numerical code, and their theories reveal a civilization thinking about time in a way utterly foreign to us. The first and most widely accepted interpretation is the mytho-historical one. These immense spans are not meant as literal chronology, but as a qualitative statement. They describe a primordial age, a time when gods walked the earth and their semi-divine representatives, established the perfect, unchanging order of civilization. In this golden age, a reign of 43,200 years symbolizes eternal stability, a kingship so divinely sanctioned that it transcends human mortality altogether. The numbers communicate perfection, not duration, but other theories look for a more concrete key. Could these years represent something else entirely? A mathematical theory suggests the numbers might be recording not individual reigns, but the entire length of a dynasty, compressed onto a single representative name. Or perhaps the unit of time was different. Maybe what we read as years were originally recorded as months, which would bring a 36,000-year reign down to a more plausible 3,000 months or 250 years. This creates its own problems, but it shows the attempt to find a rational core. Then there is the astronomical hypothesis, which ties these figures to the sacred mathematics of the cosmos. Mesopotamian scholars were brilliant astronomers and mathematicians, using a base 60 system that still influences our minutes and hours today. Numbers like 360, 1,800, and 43,200 are not random. They are multiples of key celestial numbers. Researcher Joran Freiberg has detailed how these figures relate to cosmological cycles. For instance, 43,200 is 120 times 360, linking it to ideal celestial periods. A reign length might therefore be a symbolic nod to cosmic order, positioning the king as an integral part of the universe's grand, repeating rhythms. So which is it, myth, math, or the stars? The compelling answer is likely all three intertwined. The scribes chose numbers that were cosmologically significant to describe mythic ages, creating a layered code. When they wrote that a king ruled for 1,200 years, they may have been invoking the perfection of the number 12, a symbol of completeness, while also hinting at a dynastic legacy. This forces us to confront that fundamental question: did they expect anyone to take these numbers literally? Probably not in the way we understand fact. They were communicating a different kind of truth, one about legitimacy, cosmic harmony, and the sheer weight of tradition. The numbers were a rhetorical device, overwhelming the listener with a sense of deep, immovable time, against which the current king's reign was the latest divinely appointed chapter. Decoding them requires us to step into a world where numbers held power, where history was theology, and where the length of a king's rule was less about calendar years and more about his enduring place in the story of the world. This layered understanding of time and legacy brings us to the final, most human layer of the mystery, the list's ultimate purpose and the startling discovery of what it was designed to justify. For the Mesopotamian mind, time was not a line but a circle. Our modern world is built on a linear chronology, a relentless march from past to present to future, where events happen once and are gone. But to the scribes who composed the king list, history moved in grand, repeating cycles ordained by the heavens. The rise and fall of cities, the transfer of kingship, even the Great Flood itself, were not singular events but part of a cosmic rhythm, a pattern of purification and renewal that would echo again and again. This is the profound world hidden within the list structure. Kingship, in the Sumerian language, moved in a cycle called the Bala, a word that means both reign and turn. It was a divine mandate that rotated from one city to the next, not as a random accident of war, but as a destined turn of the celestial wheel. The list is not tracking progress, it is documenting a sacred rotation. Scholar Dr. Francesca Rochberg's work on Babylonian omen texts reveals this interconnected logic. The Mesopotamians saw the cosmos as a unified whole, where patterns in the stars and planets directly mirrored and foretold events on Earth. A lunar eclipse might signal the fall of a king, a particular constellation the rise of a dynasty. In this system, time was not empty and neutral. It was charged with meaning, every moment part of a larger, repeating divine script. The incredible lengths of the pre-flood reigns make perfect sense within this framework. They represent a different, more perfect cycle of time, a primordial era where the rhythm was slower, grander, and closer to the gods. The flood, then, was not a one-time historical catastrophe, but the ultimate reset point in the cycle, a cleansing that allowed the cosmic pattern to begin anew on a more human scale. This explains why the list feels so unconcerned with factual precision as we understand it. Its primary goal was not to record when things happened in a linear sense, but to demonstrate how they happened within an eternal, divinely sanctioned pattern. It was a map of cosmic legitimacy, not a calendar. Every time a scribe wrote that kingship was carried from Kish to Yoruk, he was not just noting a political change, he was affirming the turning of the great wheel, placing his own king's reign within that timeless, reassuring rotation. This cyclical view fundamentally shaped how they recorded royal legacies. A king's greatness was measured not by unique achievements in a linear timeline, but by how well his reign embodied and maintained the divine order for his destined turn. His story was a verse in a never-ending hymn, and it is within this understanding of cyclical, pattern time that we finally encounter the list's most famous and historically tangible figure, a king who bridges the gap between mythic cycles and the world we recognize. Gilgamesh was a man who wrestled with gods and monsters, yet in the king list he appears as a simple line of text. The entry reads, Gilgamesh, whose father was a ghost, lord of Kulaba, ruled 126 years. Here, the world's first epic hero is reduced to an administrative footnote, his reign length merely long instead of impossible. The contrast is startling. In the great epic of Gilgamesh, he is a figure of towering ambition and profound grief, a king who defies the gods, mourns his friend Enkidu, and embarks on a desperate quest to conquer death itself. He seeks what the gods possess, eternal life, and fails, learning instead that his legacy must be built in the walls of his city and in the stories told about him. The epic ends with his acceptance of mortal limits, and then we have the list, which seems to grant him a compromise, a superhuman but finite reign of 126 years. The irony is profound. Gilgamesh sought immortality and found only a famous name, and that very name was then co-opted by the scribes to lend his immense cultural prestige to their dry chronology. His inclusion was a masterstroke. By placing a beloved folk hero within the official sequence of kings, the compilers borrowed the power of myth to bolster the reality of the institution. Gilgamesh was not erased by history, he was enlisted by it. His legendary status became a pillar supporting the entire structure of legitimized kingship. He was far from the only mythic figure given a historical address. Etana of Kish, for instance, appears in the list as a king who ruled 1,560 years. In older stories, Etana is the man who flew to heaven on the back of an eagle to find the plant of birth, a tale of divine aid and dynastic founding. The list strips away the eagle flight and the magical plant, but retains his name and an impossibly long reign, transforming a symbol of divine favor into a foundational king. This process reveals the scribe sources, a vast and living tapestry of oral poetry, local legends, and temple hymns. They were not inventing from nothing, they were curating, selecting the most resonant names from the culture's deep memory and repurposing them. A folk hero like Gilgamesh or Etana represented a connection to the people, a story everyone knew. By weaving that story into the official royal lineage, the state effectively claimed that popular goodwill for itself. The list acts as a great cultural bridge, spanning the chasm between the fireside tale and the palace archive. It tells us that for ancient Mesopotamians, the line between history and myth was not a wall but a doorway. The past was a resource to be shaped, and the most powerful stories were those that could serve both the heart of the people and the needs of the throne. What other names, then, might have begun as whispers in the market and ended up etched in royal clay? But the king list's silence is as powerful as its words. One of the most startling omissions is the complete absence of Sargon of Akkad, the man who forged history's first true empire. In the late 24th century before the Common Era, Sargon, an Akkadian speaker, rose from humble origins to conquer the rival Sumerian city-states, uniting them under a single, unprecedented rule that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His reign was a monumental turning point, the birth of imperial ambition. Yet in the standard Sumerian king list, his name is nowhere to be found. It is as if a seismic event was simply edited out of the official record. This was no accidental oversight. Historian Benjamin R. Foster notes that the list's compilers, working in a later period, were engaged in a project of cultural reclamation. After the Akkadian Empire eventually fell, a Sumerian cultural revival swept through the land. In this climate, scribes, likely based in the revered city of looked back and crafted a lineage that served a new purpose: to trace an unbroken, ideologically pure thread of Sumerian authority. Including Sargon, the foreign conqueror who had subjugated their ancestors, would have broken that sacred thread. His omission was a deliberate act of narrative resistance, a way for a resurgent culture to write the empire out of its foundational story and reclaim its own past. This becomes even clearer when we examine the case of Lagash. Archaeology has revealed Lagash as a major, independent power for centuries, with a rich dynasty documented by its own proud kings in countless inscriptions and statues. Yet Lagash, too, is missing from the standard king list. The likely reason is that while Lagash's rulers were powerful, they never successfully claimed the overarching title of Kingship of Sumer, the Nam Lugal that the list was meticulously charting. Their story was a local one, and for the compilers of a document meant to showcase a singular line of divinely ordained supremacy, local stories did not qualify. These glaring silences transform the king list from a neutral record into a map of political ambition. It does not document all who ruled, but only those who fit a very specific and very contested definition of legitimate power. Yet the story is not monolithic. Other versions of the list found in different cities tell a slightly altered tale. Some later Babylonian copies do include the Akkadian rulers, integrating them into the grand sequence. This variation is the final, crucial clue. It proves that the list was a living document, a tool of propaganda that could be adjusted to suit the needs of whoever held the stylus. In one city, Sargon was a disruptive foreigner to be erased. In another, he was a powerful ancestor to be claimed. These competing versions remind us that history is rarely a single story. It is a conversation, sometimes an argument, written in clay by those who control the narrative. So who, in the end, held that power in their hands? The answer lies not in the names that are written, but in the profound silence that surrounds the ones left out. The city of rose from the dust, not just as a capital but as an idea. In the century after 2100 before the Common Era, following the collapse of Sargon's Akkadian Empire, a powerful new dynasty emerged in Its kings, Namu and his son Shulgi, did not merely conquer their neighbors, they embarked on a radical project of reinvention, building a tightly centralized state that sought to control everything from temple economies to religious doctrine. This was the third dynasty of and it was in this furnace of imperial ambition that the earliest complete versions of the Sumerian king list were likely forged into their final, authoritative shape. The list was not a relic, it was a manifesto. For King Shulgi, who declared himself a god in his own lifetime, the past was raw material to be sculpted. His royal hymns loudly proclaimed his divine parentage, stating he was not born of mortal man but was the offspring of the great god Enlil himself. This was not mere boasting, It was a direct political theology, and it mirrored the core ideology of the king list perfectly. Just as the list showed kingship descending from heaven to the antediluvian rulers, so too did it now show that sacred office flowing in an unbroken line directly to the throne of The document provided the historical, or rather mythhistorical, backbone for Shulgi's extraordinary claim. Every time the list stated, and then was defeated, the kingship was taken to Isin, it was not recording a simple transfer, it was performing a sacred ritual of legitimacy in clay. For the first time, a single narrative of the past was being standardized and disseminated across the realm. Imagine the scribes of working under royal decree, sending copies of this prism to the archives of formerly independent cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur. In those rival centers, local priests and governors would unroll the clay document and read a story where their own proud dynasties were either subsumed into the grand sequence or omitted entirely, all leading inexorably to the supremacy of This was a masterstroke of psychological unification. It presented a shared heritage for cities that had spent centuries in conflict, arguing that their separate stories were always meant to be chapters in a single book, and that was the rightful author of the final page. The list was less about recording what had happened and more about dictating what should be remembered, creating a common past to justify a unified present. This explains its enduring power. When the empire of itself eventually crumbled, the list did not disappear. It was too useful a tool. The next dynasty to rise, the kings of Isin, simply took the existing prism and added their own names to the end, claiming the same divine mandate. The document became a template for legitimacy, a reusable blueprint for power. It taught every future ruler a critical lesson that to control the future, you must first control the story of the past. The clay was eternal, but the names at the end of the list could always be updated. But if we could line up the 24 surviving copies of the list, we would not see a perfect match. The fifth great mystery of these tablets is their startling lack of uniformity. From one city to the next and across centuries, the names shift, the reign lengths change, and entire dynasties appear or vanish. Comparing these fragments is like hearing the same epic poem recited by different bards, each one altering a verse to honor their own patron. One of the most telling variations is the end point. The famous Weld Blundell prism ends its narrative with the fall of the Isin dynasty, carrying the story into the early second millennium before the Common Era. Yet older, shorter lists found in places like Lagash conclude much earlier, as if the later chapters had not yet been written. This is no accident, as scholar Dr. Douglas Frayne has observed. These variations are not scribble errors, they are deliberate adaptations. Each city or newly ascendant dynasty would take the existing list, this sacred template, and simply add their own lineage to the very end, proclaiming themselves the rightful, destined heirs to all that had come before. The list was a living text, a document constantly edited to serve the pressing needs of the present. It functioned less like a fixed scripture and more like a legal charter, with blank space at the bottom for the next authorized signature. This fluidity reveals its true nature as a political instrument. The Weld Blundell prism itself is a comprehensive version, perhaps an attempt to create a definitive master copy during the Isin period. But even it is just one snapshot of a story that was always being rewritten. An older fragment from might list a king for 900 years, while a later copy from Nippur gives him only 600. A dynasty celebrated in one city's archive might be completely absent from another's. This presents a monumental puzzle for modern historians. How do scholars even begin to piece together a coherent master version from such contradictory sources? They cannot simply average the numbers or vote on the names. Instead, they become detectives, examining the clay itself, the style of the script, the archaeological layer in which the tablet was found, and cross-referencing every name with other independent inscriptions. It is a painstaking process of triangulation, building a probable chronology from a chorus of conflicting voices. This very inconsistency, however, is the proof of the list's immense cultural power. It was in such high demand as a tool of legitimacy that it was worth copying and worth altering. No one bothered to forge a document nobody cared about. The variations tell us that the past was a contested space, a battlefield of narratives where the victor won the right to inscribe his own name into the eternal cycle. This leads us to a final, modern layer of the mystery, where the ancient scribe's stylus meets the tools of 21st century science. The stylus marks on the clay are ancient, but the tools to read them are utterly new. In clean, climate-controlled laboratories, the same tablets that once sat in dusty palace archives now rest under the gentle gaze of digital microscopes and spectral imaging cameras. This is where the 21st century confronts the third millennium before the Common Era, not to dismiss the king list story, but to understand how it was built layer by layer. Since the clay itself is inorganic and cannot be dated by radiocarbon methods, archaeologists rely on a forensic science of context known as stratigraphy. Each ancient city is a layered cake of civilization, with older remains buried beneath newer ones. When a fragment of the king list is discovered, its precise depth and the surrounding artifacts like pottery, tools, or seals provide a probable time frame. A tablet found in a layer associated with the reign of King Shulgi of Ur, for instance, strongly suggests it was written during or shortly after his time. This physical context is the first anchor in a sea of mythic numbers. Alongside the dirt archaeologists are the word archaeologists, the philologists. They peer not at soil layers but at the evolution of language itself. The cuneiform script changed over centuries, with signs shifting their shapes and meanings. By analyzing the specific form of a wedge on a tablet, experts in paleography can often pinpoint its creation to within a few generations. Furthermore, the very language of the king list holds clues. Scholar Miguel Civil dedicated years to studying the phonology, the sound patterns of the royal names. He noticed that some of the earliest, most fantastical names, like Alulim and Alalga, have a linguistic structure that feels older, perhaps echoing a lost oral tradition from a time before writing. This suggests the scribes were not inventing these figures wholesale, but were compiling and formalizing names that already echoed in temple hymns or local folklore, grafting ancient roots onto their new ideological tree. The most powerful corroboration, however, comes from cross-referencing. Thousands of other clay tablets survive from Mesopotamia, most of them breathtakingly mundane. They are receipts for barley, rosters of laborers, records of temple offerings, and diplomatic letters. These administrative documents, never meant for posterity, are now a goldmine for historians. They mention kings, officials, and events in a casual, offhand manner. When a king named in the official king list also appears on a dated invoice for 500 baskets of dates, it creates a tangible link between the ideological narrative and the gritty reality of daily life. For instance, the names of several later kings on the list, whose reigns are given in more plausible decades, are independently verified by these economic texts. This is where a possible kernel of historical truth is confirmed. The list was not pure fiction. It was a grand tapestry woven with threads of real people and real places, even if the pattern it created served a higher purpose. So what have these multidisciplinary tools revealed? They paint a picture of a document with a long and complex biography. The core list was likely assembled and standardized during the Third Dynasty as a tool of unification. But its sources were far older, drawing from local dynastic records and oral traditions from competing city-states that were centuries old even then. The fantastic reign lengths for the earliest periods are confirmed as symbolic or theological, with no archaeological evidence for figures like the 43,000-year King Enmen Lu Ana. Yet for the later dynasties, the chronology, once the mythical numbers are stripped away, often aligns surprisingly well with the timeline built from thousands of mundane business tablets and architectural remains. The greatest discovery of modern analysis is not a single fact, but a methodology, a way to listen to the many voices in the clay, to hear both the boastful proclamation of the king and the quiet whisper of the merchant, and to understand how one civilization used all the stories at its disposal to build a foundation for its world. This forensic unpacking of motive and source inevitably leads us to a broader, more philosophical question, one that challenges our own modern certainty about what history is for. Sometimes a name in the clay is a ghost, a whisper without a body. The king list confidently declares the first dynasty of Kish, naming rulers like Enmebaraj, who it says reigned 900 years. For a long time, this was just another line in the mythic sequence. Then, archaeologists found something astonishing. Inscriptions at the distant site of Mari, far up the Euphrates River, mentioned a king of Kish named Enmebaraj. This was not a later copy of the list, it was an independent, contemporary reference. Suddenly, a figure from the shadowy pre-flood era had a foothold in reality. Yet when we look at the site of Kish itself, the material evidence for a powerful, unified first dynasty is frustratingly thin. There are early structures, graves, and artifacts, but no grand palace or temple complex that shouts the name of these specific kings. This is the sixth great mystery, the unsettling dance between text and dirt, between the names we are given and the cities we can actually touch. For every Enmebaraj, there are other early dynasties in the list, like the kings of Hamazi or the lords of Adab, that seem to vanish into the air, leaving almost no archaeological signature at all. Could these represent not centralized kingdoms, but loose confederations of tribes, alliances whose power was real but left a lighter footprint on the landscape? Or were they later inventions, retrojections by scribes who needed to fill the distant past with a politically useful geography of rivals and predecessors? The opposite problem is just as puzzling. Take the city of Uruk, one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in all of Mesopotamia. Its ruins reveal a massive city wall, elaborate temples like the famous White Temple on its high platform, and evidence of astonishing social complexity at a very early date. This was clearly a powerhouse, yet matching the specific kings the list assigns to Uruk's first dynasty, like Enmerkar and Lugalbanda, to the builders of these monumental structures is nearly impossible. The stones do not speak their names. Archaeologist Guillermo Algaze has long studied the rise of these early cities, and he highlights a fundamental challenge of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain. The primary building material was mud brick. Unlike stone, mud brick erodes, melts back into the earth with every rain and flood. The very rivers that gave life to these cities, the Tigris and Euphrates, are constantly shifting their courses, burying some sites under silt and erasing others entirely. A dynasty that ruled for a century might leave behind only a thin layer of discolored soil, indistinguishable from natural deposits, while a single-fired clay tablet bearing its king's name could survive for millennia. This creates a stark asymmetry. The textual record can preserve a name that archaeology cannot find, and the archaeological record can reveal a mighty city that the official texts choose to ignore. The king list, then, exists in this tense space between memory and material. Sometimes it acts as a precious preservative, holding the name of a king or a city that time would have otherwise consumed. Other times it seems to be a projector, casting the political realities of a later age back onto a blank, distant screen. This forces a humble recognition. Our picture of the deep past is a mosaic assembled from two different sets of fragments, one of baked clay and one of crumbled brick, and they do not always make the same image. How do other ancient civilizations wrestle with this same divide between legendary time and historical ground? the answers from across the world are both comforting and illuminating. The compulsion to write deep time into existence was not unique to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Across the ancient world, from the Nile Valley to the Yellow River, scribes in other emerging civilizations performed a remarkably similar ritual, grappling with the same profound questions of origin and legitimacy. They too felt the need to anchor the fragile present to a vast, immovable past, and they too used numbers of staggering scale to do it. In Egypt, a fragmented papyrus known as the Turin Royal Canon, dating to the reign of Ramesses II, lists the pharaohs who ruled before him. But it does not start with the first historical dynasties. It begins with the gods. The document opens with the reign of Ptah and other deities, who are said to have ruled for thousands of years, followed by spirits and heroic ancestors, before finally arriving at the mortal kings of the unified Egypt. The format is eerily familiar, a divine lineage leading to human authority, with the immense spans of the god-kings establishing a primordial era of perfect order. Egyptologist John Baines has observed that these lists were not administrative records but symbolic compositions, designed to show the king as the culmination of a cosmic process. The exaggerated chronology served to embed the current ruler within a framework of eternal, cyclical return, a direct parallel to the Mesopotamian concept of kingship descending from heaven. Far to the east, in ancient China, historians of the Zhou and Han dynasties compiled their own accounts of deep antiquity. They wrote of the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors, sage kings like Yao and Shun, who ruled with perfect virtue for over a century each, laying the foundations of agriculture, writing, and moral law. While their reign lengths in the Chinese texts are not in the tens of thousands, they are still impossibly long and idealized, representing a golden age of foundational order. These figures, much like the Antediluvian kings of Sumer, existed in the blurred space between myth and history. They were presented as paragons of wisdom and benevolence, their lengthy reigns symbolizing an era of stability and harmony that later emperors sought to emulate and claim descent from. The Chinese historiographical tradition meticulously wove these sage kings into a continuous narrative, creating an unbroken chain of legitimate mandate that stretched from the mythical past to the current Son of Heaven. This pattern extends beyond king lists to encompass entire systems of time. The Maya of Mesoamerica developed the long count calendar, a system capable of tracking dates over spans of millions of years, far exceeding any practical human need. Their inscriptions often placed contemporary rulers within these immense cosmic cycles, linking a king's accession or a military victory to a specific, monumental point in a grand celestial timeline. Similarly, the ancient Hindu concept of the yugas describes world ages that last for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, cycling through epochs of virtue and decline. These are not measurements of history as we understand it, but metaphysical frameworks that give human events a location within a divine and repeating cosmic drama. What these diverse traditions reveal is a universal human impulse. The Sumerian king list is not an anomaly or a curious fiction. It is a profound and early example of a shared endeavor. Scholar Jan Assmann refers to this as cultural memory, the active construction of a meaningful past that provides identity and order for the present. Whether through clay prisms, papyrus scrolls, or stone stelae, early civilizations instinctively reached for the tool of deep time. They used vast, often symbolic numbers to build a bridge, a majestic and sturdy causeway spanning the terrifying chasm between the mysterious moment of creation and the familiar yet fragile reality of the here and now. This bridge did more than connect points in time. It carried the weight of entire worldviews, justifying social structures, sanctifying political power, and answering the most fundamental question a culture can ask of itself: where do we come from, and why are things the way they are? Those 8 kings who ruled before the flood are the master key to the entire document. They are not a historical preface, they are a theological manifesto carved in clay. Their impossible reigns, stretching from 28,000 to 43,000 years, serve a singular, profound purpose: to establish that the very idea of kingship did not evolve from human need, but descended, fully formed and perfect, from the realm of the gods. This was a golden age of primordial closeness, a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin, and the rulers were beings of a different order. Scholar Dr. Alan Lindsay emphasizes that this antediluvian section is less about recording individuals and more about sacralizing an institution. By giving kingship an origin story that predates the flood, the scribes made it as eternal and unchanging as the cosmos itself. It became a divine decree, a me or foundational principle of civilization, immune to the petty squabbles and shifting alliances of the human era that followed. The king who sat on the throne in Ur or Isin was not just a powerful man, he was the latest link in a chain that reached back to the moment order was imposed upon chaos. This narrative transformed political power into a sacred duty, a burden passed down from the gods themselves. But who were these semi-divine figures meant to represent? The clues lie in another strand of Mesopotamian tradition, the myth of the 7 Apkallu. These were antediluvian sages, part fish, part human beings sent by the god Enki to bring the arts of civilization, like writing, law, and architecture, to humanity. They were the civilizing agents of the gods. Intriguingly, the king list names 8 pre-flood kings, not 7. Many researchers see a direct correlation, proposing that the first 7 kings symbolize these 7 wise sages. The 8th king, then, often associated with the city of Shuruppak, might represent a later tradition of an Apkallu who sinned or transgressed, a narrative thread that connects to the flood story as a cleansing punishment for divine knowledge misused. This linkage is powerful. It ties the institution of kingship directly to the gift of civilization. The king is not merely a ruler, he is the inheritor and guardian of the sacred knowledge the Apkallu brought, the living embodiment of culture itself. The geography of this primordial kingship is equally symbolic. The first seat of power is not a mighty military fortress, but Eridu, considered in Sumerian myth to be the first city ever created, the home of the god Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. From there, kingship moves to Bad Tabira, a cult center for the god Dumuzi, and then to other ancient holy sites. This is a procession across sacred space, not political territory. By rooting kingship in these venerable cult centers, the list anchors political authority in the deepest, most hallowed ground of Sumerian religious identity. The message is clear: true kingship is inseparable from the favor of the gods and the sanctity of the oldest temples. So what was the practical effect of this magnificent origin story on the kings who lived in the historical, post-flood world? It imbued their office with an almost unbearable weight of tradition. A king was no longer just a man who led armies or collected taxes. He was a performer in a cosmic drama, a steward of a legacy that began when the world was new. His every action was measured against the standard of that primordial, perfect age. He was expected to maintain the delicate bond between heaven and earth, to ensure the gods received their due offerings so that the community would prosper. His legitimacy depended on his ability to convincingly play this divinely scripted role. The antediluvian section, therefore, was not a quaint myth tucked at the beginning of a dry list. It was the engine of the entire document, the sacred charge that powered the claims of every king whose name followed. It answered the most critical question a subject might ask: why should we obey this man? The clay tablet provided the answer, etched in numbers so vast they defied comprehension, because his authority was older than the flood, a gift from the gods, and as timeless as the stars. This foundational myth raises a compelling parallel. How did the practical, day-to-day reality of ruling an empire measure up against such an impossibly lofty ideal? The king was never just a conqueror, he was a shepherd. This simple word, sipa in the Sumerian language, carries the entire weight of Mesopotamian political ideology. It is not a casual title but a sacred job description, and the king list is its foundational scripture. By presenting an unbroken line of rulers stretching back to the gods, the list argues that every legitimate king, from Ululim of the primordial age to Hammurabi of Babylon, was chosen by the divine to perform the same essential role, to guide, protect, and nourish the human flock entrusted to him. This metaphor transforms power from brute force into a solemn duty. Royal hymns and inscriptions are filled with this pastoral imagery. A king does not boast of his battle trophies first. He proclaims that he made the pastures abundant, that he led his people to green meadows and clear water, that he built safe folds to shelter them from harm. He is the guardian against the wolves of chaos, whether those wolves are invading armies, famine, or social injustice. The very structure of the king list reinforces this. When the document states that kingship was carried from Kish to Uruk, it is not merely recording a military defeat. In the logic of the shepherd metaphor, it is recording the moment the gods, as the ultimate owners of the flock, decided to entrust their people to a new, more capable guardian. The transfer is divinely orchestrated, a change in management for the well-being of the whole land. This ideology finds one of its clearest expressions centuries later in the prologue to the Code of Hammurabi. The famous Babylonian king does not begin his laws with a threat, but with a declaration of his divine appointment. He states that the gods Anu and Enlil named him to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. He is, in his own words, the shepherd called by the gods. His law code is thus framed not as human legislation, but as the practical tool of a divine shepherd fulfilling his ancient pastoral contract. This context casts the fantastical reign lengths of the earliest kings in a new, symbolic light. Those rulers who governed for 36,000 years were not just powerful, they represented the ideal of the shepherd in its most perfect, unchanging form. Their immense spans of rule symbolize an era of eternal, flawless provision and protection, a time when the shepherd's care was so absolute that the flock knew no hardship, no want, and no end. The Great Flood, then, becomes a pivotal moment in this pastoral drama. It is the event that introduces change, fallibility, and mortality into the system. The post-flood shepherds, with their shorter, though still lengthy reigns, must now guide their people through a world where rivers could shift, rains could fail, and rivals could attack. The shepherd's job becomes one of constant, active vigilance against a world that is no longer perpetually green. For the person holding the clay tablet, this ideology was profoundly reassuring. It meant that their king, for all his human flaws, was not a random tyrant. He was the latest link in a chain of divinely appointed caretakers. His authority was legitimate because it served a purpose greater than himself, the enduring welfare of the people. The list's endless procession of names was not a chronicle of vanity, but a roster of responsibility, a millennia-long relay race where the sacred staff of the shepherd was passed from one hand to the next. This framing answers a deeper question: why would anyone submit to such a system? The list provides the answer, etched beside each name. You submit because the one who leads you was chosen by heaven to keep you safe. The numbers were not just years, they were a measure of divinely sanctioned care. But if the king's role was to be the perfect shepherd, what happened when the fields dried up, when the rivers did not flood, or when the flock itself began to starve? How did this pristine ideology confront the messy, often brutal realities of climate, geography, and simple human failure? The numbers themselves begin to whisper a different kind of story. After the cataclysm of the flood, the king list presents a world in slow, steady descent. Atana of Kish rules for 1,560 years. His successor, Bali, reigns for 410. The line continues, a numerical staircase descending from the heavens. Gilgamesh of Uruk is granted 126 years. By the time we reach the kings of the third dynasty of the figures have plummeted to a human scale, with Namu ruling 18 years and his son Shulgi for 48. This is the list's eighth great mystery, the dramatic compression of time from the mythic to the mortal. It is not a random error, but a deliberate pattern, a numerical curve that may hold the key to how the scribes assembled their grand narrative. One compelling explanation is the antiquarian theory. Imagine the scribes in the royal archive surrounded by clay tablets. For recent centuries, they had relative abundance, administrative records, building inscriptions, and diplomatic letters that named kings and could be loosely dated by generations. But as they looked further back, beyond a few hundred years, the written record grew thin, fading into the realm of oral poetry and temple lore. Faced with this void, they did what compilers throughout history have done: they expanded the canvas. The vague, heroic past was stretched to fit the grandeur of their story, using numbers that felt appropriately ancient and divine. The distant founders were given reigns of millennia, not because anyone believed they lived that long, but because no one could prove they did not, and such scale was required by the narrative's theology. The closer the scribes got to their own era, the more factual anchors they had, pulling the numbers down to earth. Yet there is a deeper, more philosophical layer at work. The steadily shortening reigns mirror a universal mythological motif, the decline from a golden age. In cultures around the world, from the Greek ages of gold, silver, and bronze to the Hindu concept of descending yugas, there exists a profound nostalgia for a primordial era of perfection that slowly erodes over time. The Sumerian king list enacts this same story numerically. The Antediluvian age is one of god-kings and eternal stability, measured in tens of thousands of years. The world after the flood is lesser, a silver age where heroes like Gilgamesh still bridge the gap but live for centuries, not millennia. Finally, history proper begins, a bronze age of mortal men whose reigns are counted in decades, fraught with war, succession crises, and the mundane challenges of rule. This numerical decline is not a record of fact, but a statement of value, a lament for a lost world of divine proximity. However, archaeologist Harriet Crawford offers a grounding insight that connects this pattern to the dirt and stone of real cities. She suggests the list may be unconsciously reflecting a genuine sociological shift. In the earliest periods of Sumer, power was likely fluid, centered around charismatic, perhaps semi-divine figures who founded lineages and cult centers. Their legendary status in memory could easily inflate into fantastical reign lengths. But as city-states grew into complex, bureaucratic kingdoms like the Empire of the nature of kingship changed. The ruler became the head of a vast administrative machine. Succession needed to be clearer, reigns more documented, and the practical demands of governance meant that long, unchallenged rule became statistically rarer and more fragile. The shorter, more plausible reign lengths for later dynasties might therefore echo a real consolidation of the state, a move from legendary founders to mortal administrators working within a complex system. The numerical curve in this light tells a story of civilization's own maturation. So what can the specific transitional numbers tell us? A king listed for 900 years might encode the collective memory of a long and influential dynasty, compressed into a single representative name. A reign of 126 years might preserve a fragment of a forgotten lunar or seasonal cycle, now lost to us. Each number in that slow decline is a fossil, a coded piece of information about how the past was remembered before it was written. They are not random, but chosen from a palette of culturally significant numbers, 360, 1200, 1800, all multiples of 60, the base of their mathematical world. This careful selection reveals the scribes were not just making things up, they were constructing a plausible past using the sacred mathematics of their universe. The drop from millennia to decades is where the story of the gods finally hands the scroll to the story of men. The numbers on the prism are not a chaotic jumble, they hum with a hidden mathematical harmony. If you take a calculator and simply add the reign lengths of those first 8 antediluvian kings, you reach a staggering total, 241,200 years. This figure is not random. It is a beautifully round number within the Sumerian sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics that still shapes our hours and minutes today. 241,200 is divisible by 360, the schematic or ideal year in Mesopotamian thought, yielding 670 perfect cycles. This is the first major clue that we are not looking at failed history, but at deliberate numerical composition. The scribes were building a past with the sacred tools of their own scholarly tradition. As historian and mathematician Elena Robson has illuminated, Mesopotamian scholars frequently used what they called good or perfect numbers in their texts. These were not necessarily prime numbers, but numbers that held cultural and mathematical resonance, often multiples of 60 or 360. They conveyed concepts of completeness, cosmic order, and ideological perfection. A king ruling for 3,600 years was not an error, it was a statement written in the language of numbers. His reign embodied a complete, perfect unit of cosmic time. Look closer at the dynasties that follow the flood, and the pattern persists. The first dynasty of Kish lists kings with reigns like 1,200 years, 900 years, and 1,560 years. These are all multiples of 60. The number 600 appears with striking frequency across the list. This repetition is systematic. It tells us the scribes were not transcribing random, inherited figures, but were actively generating a chronology using a set of approved, significant numerical building blocks. They were composing a symphony, and the notes were multiples of 60. This transforms our understanding of the document entirely. The king list is not bad history, it is sophisticated numerical literature. Its primary goal was not chronological accuracy, but the creation of a numerically harmonious and ideologically sound past. The immense totals and the round numbers served to overwhelm the reader or listener with a sense of deep, structured, and divinely ordered time. A reign of 43,200 years feels less like a mistake and more like a monumental chord in this grand composition, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the eternal nature of kingship itself. But why would they go to such lengths? The answer lies in the Mesopotamian worldview, where mathematics, astronomy, and theology were inseparable. The heavens moved in predictable cycles, and numbers were the language of those cycles. By crafting a king list with mathematically perfect intervals, the scribes were aligning human history with cosmic order. They were asserting that the transfer of kingship, the very rhythm of civilization, moved to the same perfect numerical beat as the stars. This practice did not end with the Sumerians. This numerical tradition of using schematic, idealized figures deeply influenced later historical writing across the region. Babylonian chronicles and king lists, while often more grounded, still showed a preference for round numbers and symmetrical patterns. Even the biblical genealogies, with their long lifespans for patriarchs like Methuselah, echo this same impulse to use expansive, symbolic numbers to bridge the gap between the divine creation and the historical present. The scribes of the king list were not lying, they were speaking a different truth, one written in the universal language of sacred mathematics. They built a bridge of numbers from the gods to their own king, and every perfect multiple of 60 was a stone in that bridge, solidifying a legacy not in years but in eternal, harmonious order. The clay prisms of Mesopotamia did not speak only to their own age. Centuries after the last Sumerian scribe laid down his stylus, a Babylonian priest named Berossus sat in the great city of Babylon, his mind bridging two worlds. Living in the 3rd century before the Common Era, under the rule of the Greek Seleucid kings, Berossus undertook a remarkable task. He compiled a history of his homeland, written not in cuneiform on clay, but in Greek on papyrus, meant for a new Hellenistic audience. His work, now lost and known only through quotations by later Greek historians, directly channeled the ancient king list tradition. Berossus recounted the reigns of the Antediluvian kings, translating their fantastical millennia into a form that Greek intellectuals could grasp. He spoke of Aloros, who ruled for 10 Sari, a unit he explained as 3,600 years. Through Berossus, the Mesopotamian concept of primordial deep time, of a golden age measured in cosmic cycles, flowed directly into the bloodstream of classical knowledge. The idea that civilization began with beings of immense longevity became a curious, accepted fragment of world history for scholars from Rome to Alexandria. This was not a simple translation of names, but a transmission of an entire way of thinking about the past. The king list had escaped its cradle of clay and entered the library of the ancient world. This pattern of expansive primordial time echoes in a far more familiar place, the early chapters of the book of Genesis. In the 5th chapter, a genealogy lists the descendants of Adam before the Great Flood, patriarchs like Jared, Methuselah, and Noah. Their lifespans are not in the tens of thousands, but they are profoundly elongated by any human standard. Methuselah is famously recorded as living 969 years. For a long time, scholars debated a direct literary connection. Did the Hebrew scribes have a copy of the Sumerian king list? The consensus now suggests something more nuanced and perhaps more profound. Both traditions emerged from the shared cultural and intellectual landscape of the ancient Near East. They were drawing from a common pool of motifs and ideas about the deep past. As scholar Ronald Hendel has noted, these are not cases of copying, but of independent development within a shared milieu. The core concept is identical, that the era closest to creation was qualitatively different. Human beings then lived on a different scale of time, their great ages symbolizing vitality, divine favor, and a state of being much nearer to the original perfection of the world. The numerical systems are different, the names are unrelated, but the theological message resonates across the desert, from the ziggurats of Sumer to the scrolls of Genesis, a shared memory of a longer, grander dawn. The structural parallel is even more striking. In both narratives, this expansive primordial age is not the conclusion, but the prelude to a cataclysm. The Mesopotamian list builds systematically toward the event where the flood swept over the earth. The biblical genealogy in Genesis 5 leads inexorably to the same point, the story of Noah. This is no minor similarity. The flood operates identically in both traditions as the great divider, the cosmic reset that washes away the old world of immense years and heroic figures. After the waters recede, in both stories, lifespans contract dramatically. The post-Diluvian kings in the Sumerian list rule for centuries instead of millennia. The biblical patriarchs after Noah, like Shem and Abraham, live for hundreds of years, not nearly 1,000. The narrative function is perfectly aligned. The flood marks the irreversible transition from mythic time to historical time. This reveals the king list not as a bizarre outlier, but as a foundational model, a template for how an ancient civilization could structure its own origins, using a watery catastrophe as the hinge between the age of the gods and the age of men. The legacy of these tablets, therefore, stretches far beyond museum cases. They represent one of humanity's first and most ambitious attempts to answer profound questions. Where did we come from? How did order begin? Why do some men rule? The answers they crafted, using symbolic numbers and divinely ordained lineages, created a template for historical thought that would permeate Western consciousness. The idea of a golden age, of a fall from grace marked by a great flood, of kingship as a sacred office, these Mesopotamian concepts, filtered through intermediaries like Berossus and resonating with parallel traditions like the Bible, shaped how cultures for millennia would envision their own deep past. The tablets are not isolated relics of a forgotten kingdom. They are the bedrock. Every time a medieval scholar pondered the age of the world, or a Renaissance historian tried to reconcile ancient chronologies, they were, in a way, walking a path first laid out by the Sumerian scribes. The king list taught the world that history could be a story with a moral, a structure with a purpose, and that the authority of the present could be built upon the magnificent, invented depth of a primordial past. This leaves us with a final, reflective question about our own moment. If ancient civilizations used deep time to legitimize power, what stories about the distant past do we tell today, and what purpose do they truly serve? The king list resists a simple label, forcing a fundamental choice upon every modern reader. Is this clay prism a work of literature, or is it a broken history book? This is the ninth and perhaps most essential mystery, the debate over its very nature. On one side, scholars like Jean-Jacques Glasner argue persuasively for a literary reading. They see the list not as failed chronology, but as what Glasner calls a document of thought. In this view, the scribes were not accountants of time, but authors crafting a grand narrative. They used names and numbers the way a poet uses meter and rhyme to explore profound themes: the divine origin of power, the cyclical transfer of destiny, the heavy burden of kingship. The repetitive formula, Kish was defeated, its kingship carried to Uruk, is less a historical record and more a rhythmic refrain in an epic poem about the unstoppable wheel of fate. The impossibly long reigns are not errors, but literary devices, hyperbole designed to overwhelm the audience with the sheer weight and sanctity of tradition. The list's primary purpose was to convey a theological and political truth, not to catalogue factual events. It is a story about order, meant to justify order. A useful analogy lies in Shakespeare's history plays. He took figures like Henry V or Richard III, kings who certainly existed, and placed them within dramatic narratives filled with invented dialogue, compressed timelines, and moral lessons. No one studies Henry V to learn the exact troop movements at the Battle of Agincourt. They study it to understand Elizabethan ideas of leadership, nationhood, and divine right. The Sumerian king list operates on a similar principle for its own audience. It uses the raw material of the past, some real, some legendary, to construct a powerful story about how the world works and why the current ruler sits at the pinnacle of that story. The opposing perspective, the historical one, does not dismiss these literary qualities but insists the list cannot be ignored as a source. While acknowledging its glaring distortions and omissions, historians mine it for precious clues. The very sequence of city names, Kish, then Uruk, then hints at real shifts in regional power over centuries, echoes of which are found in archaeology. The inclusion of a figure like Gilgamesh, even with a fictional reign length, signals that the city of Uruk held a position of great cultural prestige in the collective memory. The list provides a framework, a skeleton. The historian's task is to test that skeleton against the flesh of evidence from other tablets, from architecture, from pottery sequences, to see where the literary narrative might be draped over a real historical shape. This is not about taking the numbers literally, but about listening for the whispers of real events and rivalries behind the booming voice of propaganda. The compelling resolution to this debate is that the king list is both, and it is neither, because our modern categories did not exist for its creators. It represents historiography in its earliest formative state. For the Mesopotamian scribe, there was no bright line separating factual record from ideological truth. A king's legitimacy was a fact of the cosmos, and therefore any narrative that established that legitimacy was fundamentally true, regardless of its chronological precision. The list's value lies precisely in this duality. To read it only as bad history is to miss its profound cultural meaning. To read it only as literature is to ignore the hard fragments of reality embedded within its structure. Understanding this forces us to perform a difficult act of imagination, to step into a world where the purpose of recounting the past was not primarily to inform, but to legitimize, to unify, and to connect the present to the divine. The debate, therefore, is not about which modern box to place the prism in, but about redefining what history itself meant to the people who held it. What they created was not a record of what happened, but a charter for why their world had to be the way it was. The king list was not a scroll unrolled in the market square for all to hear. Its audience was a select few, gathered in the quiet, lamplit rooms where power was curated and transmitted. Picture the Adaba, the tablet house where the sons of elite families, future priests and ministers, bent over slabs of damp clay. Their education was built on memorization and precise repetition, and among the texts they copied, again and again, were the great lists of gods, of professions, of cities, and of kings. The king list was a core part of this curriculum, not for its historical facts but for its ideological grammar. By painstakingly inscribing each formulaic line, and then Kish was defeated, its kingship was carried to Uruk. The student was not just learning cuneiform signs. He was internalizing the fundamental rhythm of Mesopotamian power, the divine logic that explained why one city rose and another fell. He was learning his own place in a story that stretched back to the creation of order itself. This was education as indoctrination, shaping the worldview of the very class that would administer the kingdom. The physical object itself tells a story of its intended use. The multi-sided prism, like the Weld Blundell example, was not a casual notepad. It was a durable, formal monument, its shape allowing for a long, continuous text that could be read by turning it in one's hands. Such an object was meant for display in a temple library or a palace archive, a reference work for the educated elite, or perhaps a sacred relic to be consulted during important ceremonies. Scholars suggest it may have been recited during coronation rituals or annual renewal festivals, its sonorous listing of names and cosmic years serving as an incantation. Hearing that Ululim ruled for 28,800 years, followed by the unbroken chain down to the present king, would have been a powerful auditory reinforcement of legitimacy, a ritual weaving of the new ruler into that eternal tapestry. This context of limited, powerful audience transforms every line of the list. The impossibly long reigns were not meant to convince a skeptical farmer. They were meant to overwhelm a young prince with the sheer weight of the tradition he was about to inherit. The omission of rival dynasties was not an oversight a common person would notice, but a pointed lesson for a future bureaucrat about who held true, divinely sanctioned authority. The list was a conversation among the powerful, a shared code that reinforced their collective right to rule. It answered the question of legitimacy not for the masses, but for the very people who needed to believe in it most to keep the system functioning. When we hold a fragment of such a prism today, we are not holding a newspaper. We are holding a teacher's manual for statecraft, a script for a sacred performance, and a key to the inner chambers of an ancient mind. This understanding of its elite audience leads to a final, poignant layer of the mystery, the very human hands that shaped this grand narrative and the personal marks they sometimes left behind in the clay. A queen once ruled the city of Kish. Her name was Kubaba, and according to one version of the king list, she was a tavern keeper who rose to hold the scepter, governing for 100 years. She is a solitary figure, a lone exception in a vast desert of male names. Her presence is a crack in the monolith, a fleeting glimpse of a reality the list otherwise works tirelessly to conceal. The 10th great mystery of these tablets is not what they include, but who they systematically exclude. Where are the women? The king list presents kingship, Nam-Lugal, as an unbroken chain of male authority stretching back to the gods. This is its official story, a narrative of fathers and sons, of divine right passed through a male line. Yet to accept this at face value is to misunderstand the intricate machinery of Mesopotamian power. While the highest office of Lugal, or king, was indeed almost exclusively held by men, influence and authority flowed through many other channels, and women were often the engineers of those hidden currents. To see this, we must look beyond the list to the clay tablets and carved seals it ignores. Consider Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the empire builder omitted from the standard list. Sargon appointed her as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the sacred city of This was not a ceremonial role. As the earthly spouse of the deity, she controlled vast temple estates, oversaw economic production, and was a central figure in the religious ideology that bound the empire together. She was also history's first author we know by name, composing powerful hymns to the goddess Inanna that blended theology with political propaganda for her father's reign. Enheduanna wielded immense soft power, her influence shaping the spiritual and cultural landscape in ways a king's decree alone could not. She was far from alone. Archaeological records from cities like Mari and Nuzi reveal queens and priestesses managing complex diplomatic correspondence, overseeing legal disputes, and controlling significant wealth and land. These women operated in the spaces the king list does not chart, in the temples, the palace's inner courts, and the networks of familial alliance. The list's focus is narrow, recording only the holder of a specific, gendered title. It is a map that only shows the peaks, ignoring the fertile valleys and powerful rivers that sustained the entire kingdom. This deliberate framing served a clear ideological purpose. By presenting a seamless male lineage, the scribes naturalized a patriarchal structure of power. It defined legitimacy as something inherited directly from father to son, or from male predecessor to male successor. This narrative was a tool of state propaganda, designed to stabilize succession and consolidate dynastic control, including women like Kubaba, or acknowledging the power of priestesses like Enheduanna, would have introduced complication, a competing source of authority that could challenge the clean, linear story of male divine right. The irony is profound, for the very gods who bestowed this male kingship were often female. The goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was central to Sumerian and Akkadian religion. She was the deity of love, war, and political power, the force that could legitimize or destroy kings. Royal hymns describe kings deriving their right to rule from their special relationship with Inanna. She was the ultimate source of the divine decrees of civilization. So while the human office of king was male, the divine source of its authority was frequently imagined as female. The list captures the human vessel but obscures the divine wellspring. This omission challenges us as modern interpreters. The Sumerian king list is not a window into the full social world of Mesopotamia. It is a carefully constructed portrait of a single, dominant idea. To find the women, we must read the silences, cross-reference with economic tablets and personal seals, and listen for the echoes of influence in poetry and correspondence. Kubaba's century of rule, etched hesitantly into one version of the list, is a whisper of a different story trying to be told. It reminds us that history is often written by the victors, but it is lived by everyone. The scribes with their style chose to tell a story of kings, but the true tapestry of the past is woven with many more threads, some of which, despite their best efforts, still gleam through the clay. The list's final line is not an accident of preservation, but a deliberate full stop. On the standard version, like the Weld Blundell Prism, the narrative concludes with the fall of the Dynasty of Isin around the early 18th century before the Common Era. The scribe does not trail off. He completes the formula one last time, recording the transfer of kingship from Isin to a new power, and then the chronicle simply ends. This abrupt terminus is the list's own final, silent statement, a historical datum carved in clay. It signals not a lack of information, but a profound shift in the world. The era of Sumerian political and cultural dominance, the very framework that gave the list its meaning, was drawing to a close. A new constellation of powers was rising in Mesopotamia, and they would tell the story of kingship in their own tongue. The Amorites, a people from the west, were establishing dynasties across the region. Their most famous scion was Hammurabi, the king who would forge the city of Babylon into an empire. Under rulers like Hammurabi, the political center of gravity shifted decisively north. The old Sumerian city-states, with their millennia of rivalries and their claims to primordial authority, were now integrated into a larger, Amorite-dominated system. The concept of kingship itself evolved. While Hammurabi still used the traditional language of the shepherd king, his famous law code and his extensive correspondence reveal a more bureaucratic, imperial model of rule. The old Sumerian king list, with its focus on the sacred transfer of power between Sumerian cities, no longer reflected the new political reality. Its narrative framework, so perfect for legitimizing the kings of Ur or Isin, had little room for a powerful Amorite ruler in Babylon who saw himself not as one link in a Sumerian chain, but as the unifier of many peoples under his own new code of justice. So the scribe stopped updating it. The list was not discarded, far from it. It became a classic text, a revered piece of literature to be studied and copied in the tablet houses, much like students might copy Homer centuries later. It was fossilized, a perfect snapshot of a worldview that had passed. New dynasties, however, did not abandon the tradition of list-making. They adapted it. The Babylonians and later the Assyrians created their own king lists and royal chronicles. These new documents often began by incorporating the ancient Sumerian kings, acknowledging that deep past, but then they seamlessly continued the lineage with their own Amorite and Akkadian-speaking rulers. They wrote in Akkadian, not Sumerian, and their focus was on building a continuous narrative that led directly to their own throne. The tradition lived on, but it was no longer Sumerian. It had been co-opted and reshaped to serve new masters, proving the enduring power of the list's core function, to connect the present ruler to the most ancient sources of authority. The end of the active Sumerian king list, therefore, marks one of the great cultural transitions in human history. It is the moment the torch of Mesopotamian civilization was passed, when the Sumerian language faded from daily speech to become the language of priests and scholars, and a new era defined by Babylon and Assyria began. The Prism's final line is a quiet witness to that passing, a testament to the fact that even the most enduring stories of legitimacy must eventually yield to the turning of time's own wheel. The techniques of the Sumerian scribes never truly vanished from the world. Their prism was an early, brilliant prototype for a practice that echoes through every age, the crafting of a national story to serve present power. When a state seeks to root its authority in something deeper than mere force, it instinctively reaches for the same tools the list employed: a deep, often exaggerated antiquity, a selective memory that highlights certain heroes and silences rivals, and a narrative of linear, inevitable destiny leading straight to the current throne. These are not ancient quirks, they are timeless instruments in the toolbox of political legitimization. We see it in what scholars term invented traditions, where ceremonies, symbols, or even entire historical epochs are formalized and sometimes fabricated to to foster unity and justify a social order. A national holiday might commemorate a battle whose significance was minimal at the time, but which later generations elevate to a sacred founding moment. The lineage of a flag or an anthem is often traced back through a curated past, its origins simplified and sanctified into a parable of identity. These stories serve the same core function as the king list. They provide a shared origin myth, a sense of common destiny that binds a people together and directs their loyalty toward the institutions that claim to embody that story. The scribes of were masters of what we might now call strategic narrative, understanding that who controls the past controls the present. Their work whispers a caution across the millennia, urging us to listen critically to any official chronicle of the deep past, to ask not just what is said, but what has been left unsaid, and whose power is solidified by the telling. The clay is a mirror, revealing that the struggle to shape history is not a modern corruption, but a foundational human endeavor as old as the first city wall. This enduring resonance is what makes these broken tablets feel so urgently contemporary. They remind us that every civilization writes its autobiography, and the first draft is always an argument for its own existence. Our journey began in the heavens, with kingship descending to a world of gods and impossibly long reigns. We navigated the great reset of the flood, crossed the contested plains of rival city-states, and deciphered the cryptic numerical code pressed into wet clay. The Sumerian king list, we have discovered, is not a failed history book. It is something far more profound. It is a foundational document of political thought, one of humanity's first attempts to answer the most urgent question of power: where does your right to rule come from? The answer etched into the prism was both simple and monumental. It comes from the gods, it is eternal, and it flows in an unbroken, destined line to me. This was not a record, it was a claim. It was a literary masterpiece, using the rhythmic cadence of names and the symbolic weight of perfect numbers to compose an epic poem about order itself. And it remains a permanent window into the ancient mind, showing us how a civilization constructs its own reality, weaving threads of myth, memory, and ambition into a tapestry that justifies the present. We have seen its role as propaganda, a tool wielded by scribes to legitimize their patron by writing rivals out of the story. We have felt its theological depth, anchoring human authority in a primordial, divine age. And we have stood before its enduring mysteries, the silent gaps, and the fantastical numbers that still whisper questions we can only partially answer. The ultimate lesson of these clay tablets is not about Sumerian chronology. It is a lesson about history itself. History is never a simple, neutral record of what happened. It is always, inevitably, a story told for a purpose. It is a narrative shaped by the hands that hold the stylus, curated to explain, to justify, and to control. The king list teaches us to listen critically to any story of the deep past, to hear both the triumphant declarations and the telling silences. As this exploration closes, take a moment to reflect on the stories we tell about our own past. Who gets to write the official version, which names are carved into the monuments and which are left in the dust? What grand narratives do we accept about where we come from and why our world is structured the way it is? The ancient scribes of Mesopotamia are not so distant from us. They simply used clay where we use data, and gods where we use ideology. But the human impulse to shape the past in order to command the present remains a constant echo across the ages. If you found this journey into the origins of historical thought fascinating, please subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our world. We would love to hear your thoughts on these ancient kings and the stories they left behind, so feel free to share your reflections in the comments below. Thank you for watching.